The operating room was Dr. Landon West's cathedral. Under the harsh white lights, with monitors beeping their electronic hymns, he wielded his scalpel like a master conductor directing a symphony of salvation. Tonight, like every night for the past 15 years, he was about to save a life. "Time is 11:47 p.m., Landon announced, his voice steady as steel. "Patient is a 34-year-old male, motorcycle accident, internal bleeding, possible spleen rupture." The nurses around him moved with practiced precision. They knew Dr. West's reputation. The surgeon who never lost his cool, never showed emotion, never let feelings cloud his judgment. Some called him brilliant, others called him cold. Landon preferred the latter. Cold meant clear thinking. Cold meant lives saved. "Scalpel," he commanded, extending his gloved hand without looking up. The blade met flesh with surgical precision, blood, tissue, the delicate dance between life and death. None of it fazed him. While other doctors might pause at the gravity of holding a human life in their hands, Landon saw only problems to solve, systems to repair. "There," he murmured, locating the source of bleeding. "Suction." Dr. Eloise Nicholas, his longtime colleague, watched from across the table. She'd worked with Landon for 8 years and still couldn't read him. His hands never trembled, his breathing never changed. Even now, with a man's life hanging by a thread, Landon's expression remained as fixed as marble. "You're like a machine," she'd once told him. He'd taken it as a compliment. 20 minutes later, the patient was stable. As the surgical team cleaned up, Landon stripped off his gloves with the same methodical precision he applied to everything else. Another life saved. Another successful night in the ICU. "Great work, everyone," Eloise said, trying to inject warmth into the sterile atmosphere. "Mr. George is going to see his daughter graduate because of what we did tonight." The nurses smiled, sharing that moment of connection that comes from saving a life together. Landon simply nodded and headed for the door. Emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford. In the ICU, feelings got people killed. As Landon walked through the hospital corridors, he passed the same sights he'd seen thousands of times before. Worried families clutching coffee cups, night shift nurses checking charts, the soft glow of patient room lights where people fought their private battles against pain, fear, and mortality. He felt nothing for any of it, or so he told himself. In the locker room, Landon changed from scrubs into his street clothes with the same efficiency he brought to surgery. Gray slacks, white button-down shirt, navy blazer. The uniform of a man who had built walls so high around his heart that even he had forgotten what lay behind them. His phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Nicholas. "Want to grab coffee? That was a tough one tonight." He deleted the message without responding. Tough? It was Tuesday. Every night was tough in trauma surgery. That was the job. He grabbed his keys and headed for the parking garage. Outside, rain was beginning to fall, the kind of steady drizzle that made the world look gray and forgettable. Perfect weather for a man who preferred to feel nothing at all. But as Landon walked toward his car, something strange happened. For just a moment, he thought he heard something, a whisper, soft and desperate, like a prayer carried on the wind. He paused, looking around the empty garage, but there was no one there. Just his imagination, fatigue from a long shift, nothing more. He got in his car, started the engine, and drove into the night, unaware that in less than an hour, his carefully constructed world of emotional detachment would shatter like glass on asphalt.
The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the rain as Landon navigated the winding road toward his apartment. The digital clock glowed 1:23 a.m. Another late night, another life saved, another day of keeping the world at arm's length. Classical music played softly from the car's speakers. Bach's Goldberg variations, precise and mathematical, just the way Landon preferred his world. No messy emotions, no unpredictable human drama, just the pure logic of musical structure. The road ahead was empty, a ribbon of asphalt disappearing into darkness. This was Landon's favorite part of the drive home. The solitude, the silence, the blessed absence of other people's problems and pain. He didn't see the semi-truck until it was too late. The truck driver had lost control on the slick pavement. 18 wheels of steel and cargo sliding sideways across both lanes, blocking any escape. In the split second before impact, time seemed to stretch and bend. Landon's analytical mind, trained to process information under extreme pressure, registered every detail with crystal clarity. The truck's license plate, Michigan. The time on his dashboard, 1:27 a.m. The last notes of Bach still playing as his world exploded into chaos. The impact was devastating. Landon's sedan crumpled like paper against the truck's massive bulk. The steering wheel slammed into his chest, forcing the air from his lungs. Glass erupted inward, finding every exposed inch of skin. Metal screamed against metal as physics played out its violent equation. But in that moment of absolute chaos, something impossible happened. As consciousness began to fade, as darkness crept in from the edges of his vision, Landon heard something that shouldn't have been possible. "Please, God, don't let him die alone." The voice was clear as a bell, but no one was speaking. Through his shattered windshield, he could see the truck driver stumbling from his cab, already reaching for his phone to call for help. The man's lips weren't moving, but somehow Landon heard his prayer as clearly as if he'd shouted it. "I've got kids at home. Please don't let this be my fault. Please don't let him die." Landon tried to speak, to tell the man he was alive, but his voice wouldn't come. Blood filled his mouth and his vision blurred. The last thing he remembered before the darkness took him was the sound of sirens in the distance and that strange, impossible voice praying for his life. The irony wasn't lost on him, even as consciousness slipped away. Dr. Landon West, the man who had saved so many lives, now hung between life and death himself, listening to the prayers of a stranger who feared he'd killed him. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes later. The paramedics, some of whom had worked with Landon countless times, didn't recognize their colleague in the mangled wreckage. To them, he was just another trauma victim, another broken body to be pieced back together. As they worked to extract him from the twisted metal, one of them commented on how lucky he was to be alive. "Should have been DOA," she murmured, checking his vitals. Someone was watching out for this guy. If Landon had been conscious, he might have heard the paramedics' words. He might have wondered who exactly had been watching out for him. But he was already gone, floating in that strange space between life and death, where impossible things begin to seem possible, and the walls we build around our hearts can finally start to crack. The last conscious thought he had was of that voice, the truck driver's prayer, clear and desperate, and somehow heard. But that was impossible, wasn't it? Consciousness returned like a slow tide, bringing pain as its companion. Landon's first sensation was of drowning in light, harsh medical light that he knew all too well. The same lights he'd worked under for 15 years, now blazing down on him from the wrong side. He tried to move and immediately regretted it. Pain shot through his body like electricity, reminding him of the crash, the truck, the impossible voice he'd heard. His left leg was elevated in traction, his right arm was in a cast. Bandages covered what felt like half his face. "Easy there, Dr. West." The voice belonged to Lucy Santos, one of his ICU nurses. "You're in the trauma unit. You've been unconscious for 3 days." 3 days? Landon tried to speak, but only managed to croak. Lucy held a water cup to his lips, and he gratefully took small sips. The irony of being cared for by someone he'd worked beside countless times wasn't lost on him. "What's the damage?" he managed to whisper. Lucy consulted his chart, with the professional demeanor he'd seen her use with thousands of other patients. 3 broken ribs, collapsed lung, broken fibula, concussion, and more stitches than I can count. But you're alive, doctor. That's what matters. As the hours passed, Landon began to adjust to his new reality. He was in bed 7 of the trauma UCU, a bed where he had pronounced time of death on more patients than he cared to remember. The monitors around him beeped and hummed with electronic efficiency, tracking every heartbeat, every breath, every sign of life. Dr. Nicholas visited that evening, her usual professional composure cracked with genuine concern. "You scared us, Landon. When they brought you in, I didn't think—" She trailed off, then forced a smile. "But here you are, being stubborn as always." Landon tried to return the smile, but something was wrong. As Eloise spoke, he kept getting distracted by sounds that didn't make sense. Whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Fragments of conversation that no one else appeared to hear. "I'm worried about my daughter. She's only 16. What if I don't make it home?" The voice was clear, concerned, definitely not Eloise's. Landon looked around the ICU bay trying to locate the source, but Eloise continued talking about his medical chart, apparently oblivious to the other voice. "The bills are piling up. I don't know how my wife will manage if I don't pull through this." Another voice, different from the first. This one sounded older, tired. Landon's eyes darted around the room again, but he saw only the usual ICU scene. Nurses checking monitors, families keeping quiet vigil, patients sleeping under the influence of powerful medications. "Doctor?" Eloise was looking at him with concern. "Are you experiencing any confusion, hallucinations? That's common with head trauma." Hallucinations. Yes, that had to be it. The concussion, the medications, the trauma of the accident, all perfectly logical explanations for what he was hearing. Landon was a man of science. He didn't believe in impossible things. "Just tired," he told Eloise. "The medication is making me foggy." But as Eloise left and the ICU settled into its nighttime rhythm, the voices didn't fade. If anything, they grew clearer. And slowly, terrifyingly, Landon began to realize what he was hearing. Prayers. Silent prayers. Whispered in the minds of patients around him, never spoken aloud, but somehow transmitted directly to his consciousness. The teenage girl in bed 3 praying she wouldn't die before seeing her baby brother grow up. The elderly man in bed 12 begging forgiveness for words left unspoken to his son. It was medically impossible, scientifically absurd, and absolutely, undeniably real. As the night wore on, Landon lay awake, listening to the chorus of unspoken fears, hopes, and desperate pleas that filled the ICU. For the first time in his adult life, the man who had built his career on logic and detachment found himself face to face with something that defied every rule he'd ever lived by. The voices were real. The prayers were real. And somehow, impossibly, he was the only one who could hear them. Night in the ICU was when the whispers grew strongest. As the overhead lights dimmed and the daytime bustle gave way to the quiet vigilance of the night shift, Landon found himself trapped in a symphony of unspoken prayers. "Please don't let the cancer spread. I have so much left to do." The voice belonged to Mrs. Patterson in bed 4, a 62-year-old teacher who'd been admitted for complications following surgery. To anyone watching, she appeared to be sleeping peacefully, but Landon could hear her mind racing, cycling through the same desperate plea over and over again. "God, I'm scared. I'm so scared I can't breathe. What if I never see my mom again?" This voice was younger, trembling with fear. Bed 3, Emma George, the 17-year-old who'd been in a car accident 3 days before Landon's own crash. Her external injuries were healing, but inside her mind, terror ruled every waking moment. Landon squeezed his eyes shut, willing the voices to stop. He was a trauma surgeon, not a mind reader. This was impossible. But the prayers continued, layer upon layer of human anguish and hope bleeding into his consciousness. "I promised my wife I'd quit smoking. 30 years too late. But maybe it's not too late to keep this promise." Mr. Nicholas in bed 8, a heavy-set man with emphysema, his prayer tinged with regret and a desperate hope for redemption. During the day, he joked with the nurses and flirted with his wife. At night, alone with his thoughts, he bargained with God for more time. Landon had treated hundreds of patients like Mr. Nicholas, knew their medical histories, their treatments, their prognoses, but he'd never known this, the private conversations they held with whatever force they believed might be listening. The raw honesty that emerged only in the darkness, when pain and fear stripped away all pretense. "I don't want to be a burden. Maybe it would be better if I just let go." This whisper stopped Landon cold. The voice was thin, defeated, coming from bed 11, where an elderly woman named Dorothy Mills lay recovering from a stroke. To the medical staff, she was a model patient, cooperative, uncomplaining, grateful for every small kindness. But in her mind, she was ready to die rather than become what she saw as a burden to her children. For the first time since his accident, Landon felt something crack in his chest that had nothing to do with broken ribs. This woman, someone he'd barely noticed during his years of working this ICU, was giving up. And no one knew it. No one could hear her silent surrender except him. He tried to call for a nurse to somehow communicate what he was hearing, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he explain that he was eavesdropping on thoughts? Who would believe him? More importantly, who would trust him to continue practicing medicine if they thought he was having delusions? As dawn approached, the whispers began to fade, replaced by the bustle of shift change. Nurses arrived with fresh energy and steaming coffee cups. Doctors began their rounds, checking charts and making notes about progress and setbacks. Dr. Nicholas stopped by his bed around 7 a.m. "How are you feeling today, Landon? Any improvement in the pain levels?" Landon studied her face, wondering if she would hear what he was about to say as medical observation or psychiatric break. "Eloise, I need you to check on Dorothy Mills in bed 11. I think she might be having thoughts of self-harm." Eloise's eyebrows rose. "What makes you think that? Her vitals are stable and she's been very cooperative with treatment." "Just a feeling," Landon said, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue. "Call it doctor's instinct." Eloise nodded slowly. "I'll have Dr. Martinez take a look. Your instincts have always been good, even from a hospital bed, apparently." But as Eloise walked away, Landon knew his instincts had nothing to do with it. He was hearing something that shouldn't exist, experiencing something that science couldn't explain. And the worst part was, he was beginning to understand that this wasn't a symptom of his injuries. This was a gift, or maybe a curse, and it was only the beginning. By his 5th day in the ICU, Landon had learned to navigate the strange new reality of his gift. The prayers came in waves, strongest at night, during shift changes, and in the quiet moments when pain medication wore thin and fear crept back in. He began to test what he was hearing. "Nurse Santos," he called during Lucy's morning rounds, "could you check Mr. Nicholas's oxygen levels? I think he might be having some respiratory distress." Lucy looked puzzled. "His monitors are showing normal ranges, doctor." "Please, just check." She did, and found Mr. Nicholas's blood oxygen was indeed dropping, a subtle change that the monitors hadn't yet detected, but his labored breathing had betrayed through his silent prayers for easier breath. Word spread quickly through the ICU about Dr. West's uncanny intuition. Even bedridden and heavily medicated, he seemed to sense problems before they became critical. When he suggested checking Emma George for signs of internal bleeding, they found a small leak that could have been dangerous if left undetected. When he mentioned that Mrs. Patterson might be experiencing more pain than she was reporting, they discovered she'd been stoically enduring agony to avoid being seen as difficult. "It's incredible," Dr. Nicholas confided to Lucy during a quiet moment. "Even from his bed, Landon's diagnostic instincts are sharper than most of us standing right here. He's reading patients like he has some kind of sixth sense." If only they knew how accurate that assessment was. But Landon's growing confidence was tempered by exhaustion. The constant stream of unspoken prayers was overwhelming. Every fear, every hope, every desperate bargain with the divine, it all flowed through his consciousness without filter or respite. He was learning things about his patients that no medical school had prepared him for. Emma George wasn't just afraid of dying. She was pregnant and hadn't told anyone, terrified that her traditional family would disown her. Her prayers alternated between begging for survival and pleading for the courage to tell her mother about the baby. Mr. Nicholas's emphysema wasn't just a medical condition, it was a source of crushing guilt. He'd started smoking to cope with the death of his first child 25 years ago, and now he was convinced his illness was divine punishment for his weakness. Dorothy Mills wasn't ready to die because she was tired of living. She was ready to die because she believed her medical bills would bankrupt her children. Her prayers were full of calculations, weighing the cost of her care against her children's futures. These weren't just patients anymore. They were whole human beings with complex inner lives, fears that went far beyond their medical diagnoses, hopes that had nothing to do with healing. And Landon was the unwilling keeper of all their secrets. On his 6th night in the ICU, a new patient was brought in, a middle-aged construction worker who'd fallen from scaffolding. As the trauma team worked to stabilize him, Landon heard something that made his blood run cold. "I did it on purpose. God help me, I did it on purpose. I couldn't find another way out." The man had jumped. What everyone was treating as an accident was actually a suicide attempt, and only Landon knew the truth. The medical team was focusing on physical injuries while ignoring the deeper wounds that had led to this moment. This time, Landon didn't hesitate. "Dr. Nicholas," he called out as she passed his bed. "The new patient, Mr. Williams, he needs a psychiatric evaluation along with his physical treatment." Eloise paused. "What makes you think that? There's nothing in his history to suggest—" "Trust me," Landon interrupted. "Please, just trust me on this." The psychiatric evaluation revealed severe depression and suicidal ideation. Mr. Williams was placed on suicide watch, potentially saving his life a second time. But the incident left Landon shaken. He wasn't just hearing prayers anymore. He was being trusted with information that could mean the difference between life and death. As he lay in his bed that night, listening to the chorus of unspoken fears around him, Landon began to understand that his accident hadn't just broken his bones. It had broken something else entirely. The
the wall he'd built between himself and the full reality of human suffering. And now, whether he wanted it or not, he was being forced to confront everything he'd spent 15 years avoiding. The prayers continued, each one a reminder that healing involved so much more than he'd ever imagined.
Dr. Patricia Reeves arrived at 8 a.m. sharp, clipboard in hand and skepticism written across her face. The hospital's chief of psychiatry was known for her methodical approach to unusual cases, and Dr. Landon West had definitely become an unusual case. "Dr. West," she said, settling into the chair beside his bed with professional courtesy masking obvious concern. "I'm Dr. Reeves. Dr. Nicholas has asked me to evaluate your recent insights regarding patient care." Landon had been dreading this conversation. Word of his uncanny diagnostic accuracy had spread beyond the ICU, reaching the attention of hospital administration. His colleagues were calling it intuition, but the psychiatry department was using different words entirely. "I understand you've been experiencing what some might call enhanced perception regarding your fellow patients," Dr. Reeves continued, consulting her notes. "Predicting complications, sensing emotional distress that isn't immediately apparent. Some might find this concerning, given your recent head trauma." "My diagnostic abilities haven't changed," Landon replied carefully. "I'm simply applying 15 years of medical experience to what I observe around me." "From a hospital bed, with limited mobility and significant pain medication affecting your cognitive function," Dr. Reeves raised an eyebrow. "Dr. West, yesterday you correctly predicted that a patient 3 beds away was experiencing internal bleeding before any monitors detected it. You've identified emotional distress in patients who showed no external signs. Some of your colleagues are concerned that you might be experiencing auditory hallucinations." The word hung in the air between them like an accusation. Hallucinations, the clinical term for what happens when the mind breaks down, when reality becomes unreliable, when a surgeon can no longer be trusted with human life. "I've seen the effects of head trauma. Temporal lobe injuries can cause auditory phenomena, hearing voices, perceiving sounds that aren't there. It's nothing to be ashamed of, but it is something we need to address before you return to active surgery." Landon felt a chill that had nothing to do with hospital air conditioning. If they declared him mentally unfit, his career was over. Everything he'd built, every life he might save in the future, all of it would disappear because he couldn't explain hearing the prayers of suffering people. "Dr. Reeves, I assure you that my mental faculties are intact. I'm not hearing voices. I'm making educated medical observations based on subtle cues that years of experience have taught me to recognize." Even as he spoke the words, Landon could hear the prayers around him. Mrs. Patterson was pleading for strength to face another round of chemotherapy. Emma George was asking for the courage to tell her family about her pregnancy. Mr. Williams was bargaining for a reason to keep living. "I'd like to conduct a few tests," Dr. Reeves said, pulling out a small recording device. "Simple cognitive assessments to establish baseline mental function, standard procedure for any physician recovering from head trauma." The tests were exhausting. Memory games, word associations, logical puzzles designed to map the landscape of his thinking. Through it all, the prayers continued, a constant background chorus of human need that Dr. Reeves couldn't hear and Landon couldn't ignore. "Your cognitive function appears normal, but I'm recommending continued observation. Head trauma can have delayed effects, and some of your recent behaviors suggest potential auditory processing irregularities." After Dr. Reeves left, Dr. Nicholas approached Landon's bed with obvious discomfort.
Landon, I want you to know that I requested the psychiatric consultation out of concern for your well-being, not because I doubt your competence, but some of your recent insights, they're raising questions. What kind of questions? The kind that could affect your medical license if people start thinking you're having episodes. I need you to be careful. Whatever's happening with your diagnostic abilities, you need to be able to explain it in terms that won't make administrators nervous. That night, as the ICU settled into its quiet rhythm, Landon lay awake wrestling with an impossible choice. He could deny what he was hearing, dismiss it as hallucination, and probably save his career. Or he could accept that something beyond medical explanation was happening to him and risk losing everything he'd worked for. But as he listened to Dorothy Mills pray for the courage to fight a little longer, and heard Mr. Nicholas promise God he'd be a better father if given more time, Landon realized that some things were more important than careers. The prayers were real, the need was real, and maybe, just maybe, he was meant to listen.
On his 8th day in the ICU, Landon made a decision that would change everything. He stopped pretending he couldn't hear the prayers. It started with Emma George. The 17-year-old had been putting on a brave face for her family, smiling through their visits and insisting she was fine. But Landon could hear her terror in the quiet moments, her desperate pleas for strength, and her anguish about the secret she carried. When her mother stepped out to get coffee, Landon spoke quietly from his bed across the bay. "Emma, you don't have to be afraid." She turned toward him, surprised. In the weeks since his accident, they'd barely exchanged words beyond polite greetings. "I'm not afraid," she said automatically, the response she'd given everyone who asked. "You're terrified about telling your family about the baby," Landon said gently, "and you're scared they won't love you anymore." Emma's face went white. How did you know?" "I can see that you're carrying more than just physical pain," Landon said, choosing his words carefully. "And I want you to know that love, real love, doesn't disappear because of mistakes or unexpected news. Your family loves you, Emma. They'll find a way through this together." Tears began streaming down Emma's face, the first tears she had allowed herself since the accident. "I'm so scared, Dr. West. I'm only 17. I don't know how to be a mother. I don't know how to tell them." "You don't have to know everything right now," Landon replied. "You just have to be honest. The people who love you will help you figure out the rest." For the next hour, they talked. Landon found himself offering the kind of emotional support he'd never provided as a surgeon, addressing fears that went far beyond medical charts and treatment plans. When Emma's mother returned, she found her daughter crying, but somehow more at peace than she'd been in weeks. "Dr. West helped me realize some things," Emma told her mother. "Mom, we need to talk. Really talk." Word of Landon's conversation with Emma spread quickly through the small world of the ICU. Nurses noticed that patients seemed to open up to him in ways that surprised everyone. Mrs. Patterson confided fears about her cancer that she'd never shared with her doctors. Mr. Nicholas talked about his guilt over smoking and his desperate desire to see his grandchildren grow up. Dr. Nicholas observed these interactions with growing amazement and concern. "Landon, what's happening here? Patients are responding to you like you understand something the rest of us are missing." "Maybe I do," Landon admitted. "Maybe this accident gave me perspective I didn't have before. When you're lying in one of these beds, you realize that healing is about more than fixing what's broken in the body." That evening, Dorothy Mills in bed 11 was having a particularly difficult night. Her prayers had grown more desperate, filled with calculations about funeral costs,
and relief that her suffering might finally end. Landon couldn't ignore what he was hearing. "Mrs. Mills," he called softly across the ICU. The elderly woman turned toward him, her eyes reflecting the glow of the medical equipment. "Yes, doctor? Your children don't see you as a burden. They see you as their mother, and they're grateful for every day they have with you." Dorothy's breath caught. I don't know what you mean." "You've been worrying about the cost of your care, thinking it would be easier for everyone if you just let go. But Mrs. Mills, your value isn't measured in medical bills. Your children would rather face financial hardship than lose their mother." The words hung in the air between them. Dorothy stared at Landon with an expression of wonder and fear, as if he'd somehow looked directly into her soul. "How could you possibly know that?" she whispered. "Because I've learned to listen, really listen. And what I hear is that you're not ready to give up. You're just afraid of being a burden. But love doesn't work that way, Mrs. Mills. Real love sees you as worth fighting for, regardless of the cost." Dorothy began to cry, quiet tears that seemed to wash away weeks of accumulated despair. For the first time since her stroke, she pressed the call button, not because she needed medical attention, but because she wanted to call her daughter and tell her she loved her. As Landon watched this transformation, he felt something shift inside his own chest. For 15 years, he'd treated symptoms and injuries while remaining blind to the deeper wounds his patients carried. He'd saved lives while ignoring the souls that inhabited those bodies. The accident hadn't just given him the ability to hear prayers, it had given him permission to care about the whole person, not just the medical problem. And for the first time in his adult life, that didn't feel like a weakness. It felt like healing.
The voice that woke Landon from restless sleep was different from the others. Higher, younger, filled with the kind of pure faith that only children possess.
"Please, God, don't let Mommy cry anymore. She thinks I can't hear her, but I can. She cries every night when she thinks I'm sleeping. I don't want to make Mommy sad. If you need to take me home, that's okay, but please don't let Mommy be sad forever."
The prayer hit Landon like a physical blow. He'd heard many desperate pleas from his fellow patients, but this one carried the innocent selflessness of childhood. Somewhere in the hospital, a child was dying, and his biggest concern wasn't his own fear, it was his mother's grief. Landon pressed his call button. When Lucy Santos appeared, he asked a question that surprised them both. "Is there a pediatric patient named something like Room 304, a young boy?" Lucy's expression grew guarded. "Dr. West, pediatric cases aren't really—" "Please, Lucy, I need to know about this child." She hesitated, then consulted her tablet. "Room 304 is Timothy Walsh, 8 years old, leukemia. He's not responding to treatment. The family has been here for 3 weeks. 8 years old. Landon closed his eyes, feeling a pain that had nothing to do with his injuries. He'd treated pediatric trauma cases before, but always with professional detachment. This was different. This child's prayer had reached him across floors of concrete and steel, as clear as if the boy were lying in the next bed. "I need to see him," Landon said. "Doctor, you're not cleared to leave your bed, and pediatric has strict visitation policies. Please, Lucy, this is important." Something in his voice made her pause. Over the past week, she'd watched Dr. West transform from the emotionally distant surgeon she'd known for years into someone who seemed to genuinely care about the people around him. If he said this was important, maybe it was. "I could arrange for you to be transferred to a wheelchair for a brief visit, but just for a few minutes, and only if his parents consent."
An hour later, Landon found himself being wheeled through the hospital corridors he'd walked thousands of times as a surgeon. Everything looked different from this angle. Lower, more vulnerable, more human. When they reached room 304, he could see through the partially open door a scene that broke his heart. A small boy, bald from chemotherapy, but with eyes that sparkled with life, was trying to comfort his mother. She sat beside his bed, tears streaming down her face as she attempted to read him a story. The boy kept patting her hand, telling her it was okay, that he wasn't scared. "Timothy," said Lucy gently, "this is Dr. West. He wanted to meet you." The boy looked up with curiosity and immediate warmth. "Are you sick too, Dr. West? You have bandages like me." "I was in an accident," Landon explained, rolling his wheelchair closer to the bed. "I've been hearing that you're very brave." Timothy shrugged with the casual acceptance of a child who'd learned too much about hospitals. "Mommy says brave people help other people feel better, so I try to help Mommy not be scared." Landon felt his throat tighten. This child, facing his own mortality, was more concerned about his mother's emotional well-being than his own condition. It was a selflessness that put Landon's years of emotional detachment to shame. "Timothy, do you ever talk to God?" The boy's face lit up. "All the time. Mommy taught me that God always listens, even when other people can't." "What do you tell him?" "Mostly I ask him to help Mommy be happy. And Daddy too." "They're really sad, but they try to pretend they're not. Adults think kids don't notice, but we do." Landon leaned forward in his wheelchair. "Timothy, what if I told you that God hears every word you pray and that He's been working to help your family in ways you might not see yet?" The boy considered this with the seriousness that sick children develop too early. "Do you think He'll make me better?" It was the question Landon couldn't answer as a doctor, but somehow found himself addressing as a human being who'd learned to hear the voice of faith. "I think God is going to do something amazing for you and your family. I don't know exactly what, but I believe it's going to be something that helps everyone, including your mommy, understand how much love really means." Timothy smiled, a radiant expression that transformed his thin, pale face. "I think so too. I prayed for someone to help Mommy understand that I'm not really leaving, just going somewhere different for a while." As Landon was wheeled back to his own bed, Timothy's prayer echoed in his mind. The child wasn't asking to be cured. He was asking for his family to find peace with whatever came next. It was a prayer of profound faith and love, the kind of spiritual maturity that made Landon question everything he thought he knew about healing. That night, Landon made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. He was going to do everything in his power to help that family, even if it meant stepping far outside the bounds of traditional medicine. For the first time in his career, he was going to treat the soul as well as the body.
As Landon's ability to hear prayers grew stronger, he began to detect darker whispers, threading through the chorus of hope and fear. Not all the voices carried pleas for healing or peace. Some carried secrets that chilled him to the bone. "If they discharge me tomorrow, I'll be free from all of this. The bridge over Miller Creek, that's where I'll finally find some peace." The voice belonged to James Morrison, a middle-aged accountant in bed 6, who was recovering from what everyone believed was an accidental fall down his apartment stairs. To the medical staff, he was a model patient, polite, cooperative, grateful for care. But in the privacy of his thoughts, he was planning his own death. Landon had heard suicidal ideation before in Mr. Williams, but this was different.
Morrison wasn't crying out for help or bargaining with God. His mental voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had made peace with his decision to die. But Morrison wasn't the only one carrying dangerous secrets. In bed 14, Mrs. Eleanor Vaughn was hiding her insulin injections from the medical staff, deliberately causing her blood sugar to spike because she believed her diabetes was God's punishment for past sins. Her prayers were filled with self-recrimination and a twisted desire for divine justice. I deserve this suffering. I've been hiding my medication because I need to pay for what I did to Eloise all those years ago. Maybe if I suffer enough, God will forgive me. And in bed 2, college student Henry was concealing severe chest pain because he was uninsured and terrified of the bills. His prayers alternated between begging for the pain to stop and pleading with God to let him die rather than bankrupt his immigrant parents. Please don't let Mom find out how much this is costing. She worked 3 jobs to get me through school. I can't destroy everything she sacrificed for. If I die, at least the bills die with me. Landon found himself trapped in an ethical nightmare. He was privy to information that could save lives, but acting on it would require explaining how he knew things that were medically impossible to know. Worse, some of these patients weren't asking for help. They were actively hiding from it. The weight of their secrets pressed down on him like a physical force. Every prayer he heard became another burden to carry, another moral choice to make. Save Morrison by having him placed on psychiatric hold? Expose Mrs. Vaughn's self-destructive behavior? Force Henry to confront his financial fears? Each intervention would require betraying the trust of people who believed their thoughts were private. But failing to act would make him complicit in their suffering and potentially their deaths. "Dr. Nicholas," he called during her evening rounds, "I need to speak with you about several patients." Eloise approached with the weary expression of someone who'd been dealing with Landon's insights for over a week. "What is it now?" "James Morrison in bed 6. He needs a psychiatric evaluation before discharge. I believe he may be a danger to himself." "Landon, he's scheduled for discharge tomorrow. His injuries are healed, his mental status exams have been normal, and he's shown no signs of depression or suicidal ideation. Trust me on this, please." Eloise studied his face, seeing something in his expression that made her hesitate. "What makes you think he's suicidal?" "He's too calm," Landon said, grasping for an explanation that wouldn't sound insane. "In 15 years of trauma surgery, I've learned to recognize the difference between genuine recovery and someone who's given up fighting. Morrison has given up. That's not really a clinical diagnosis, Landon." "Then humor me. One more evaluation. What's the worst that happens? We delay his discharge by a day and confirm he's fine. What's the worst that happens if I'm right and we send him home?" The question hung in the air between them. Eloise knew Landon's diagnostic instincts had been uncannily accurate since his accident, but this request felt different, more personal, more desperate. "I'll talk to psychiatry," she agreed reluctantly. "But Landon, you can't keep making requests like this without better justification. People are starting to ask questions about your methods." As Eloise walked away, Landon closed his eyes and tried to block out the prayers that continued to flow around him. Each voice represented a person whose pain went deeper than any medical chart could record. Each prayer was a cry for help that no one else could hear. He was beginning to understand that his gift came with a terrible responsibility. He could hear what people truly needed, but helping them meant risking everything he'd worked for. And some needs were too dark, too complex, too dangerous for any one person to address. But as he listened to Morrison's calm plans for self-destruction and Mrs. Vaughn's twisted desire for suffering, and Henry's willingness to die rather than burden his immigrant parents, Landon realized that some risks were worth taking, even if it meant sacrificing everything he'd once thought mattered.
The prayer that changed everything came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday night, whispered in a voice Landon recognized but had never expected to hear speaking on his behalf. God, please help Dr. West find his way back to who he used to be. I know he seems cold, and I know I've complained about him plenty of times, but underneath all that ice, there's a good man. He saves people every day, but he doesn't know how to save himself from his own loneliness. The voice belonged to Lucy Santos, the same nurse who had cared for him since his accident, who had worked beside him for 8 years, who had always maintained professional courtesy despite never seeming to particularly like him. And now, in the quiet of the night shift, she was praying for his emotional healing. I see how isolated he is, Lord, how he pushes everyone away because he thinks caring makes him weak. But look what's happened since his accident. He's finally starting to connect with people, to really see them. Don't let him lose that when he goes back to surgery. Don't let him build those walls again. Landon felt tears begin to slide down his cheeks, the first tears he'd shed in over 20 years. Here was a woman he'd barely acknowledged as a person, someone he'd treated with professional courtesy, but never genuine warmth. And she was praying for his spiritual well-being with the tenderness of someone who truly cared. He's been different since the accident, Lucy's mental voice continued. More human, more present. I think maybe that's what the accident was for, not to hurt him, but to crack open that shell he's been hiding in. Help him stay cracked open, God. Help him remember that being a great surgeon isn't worth much if you forget how to be a great human being. The prayer revealed truths about himself that Landon had spent years avoiding. Lucy had seen through his professional facade to the loneliness beneath. She'd recognized that his emotional detachment wasn't strength, it was fear. And somehow, despite his years of treating her as little more than a competent assistant, she cared enough to pray for his healing. I've watched him with the other patients this week, the way he really listened to Emma George when she needed someone to understand, how he helped Mrs. Mills remember that she's worth fighting for. That's who he really is underneath all that armor. That's the Dr. West who could change lives if he let himself. As Lucy's prayer faded and she moved on to check other patients, Landon lay in the darkness grappling with a revelation that shook him to his core. For 15 years, he'd convinced himself that his emotional distance was professional necessity. He'd told himself that feelings clouded judgment, that caring too much led to mistakes, that the best doctors were the ones who stayed detached. But Lucy's prayer revealed the truth. His detachment hadn't made him a better doctor. It had made him a lonelier human being. And the people around him, even those he'd barely noticed, had been watching his isolation with compassion he'd never imagined existed. The next morning, when Lucy came to check his vitals, Landon did something he'd never done in 8 years of working together. He really looked at her, not as a nurse following his orders, but as a person who had been caring for him in ways that went far beyond medical necessity. "Lucy," he said softly, "thank you." She paused in adjusting his IV line. "For what, Dr. West?" "For seeing something in me that I'd forgotten was there." Lucy studied his face, perhaps recognizing something different in his expression. "You've been through a trauma, doctor. Sometimes it takes breaking something to find out what's really inside. Have you ever felt like you've spent years being the wrong version of yourself?" The question seemed to surprise her, but she answered with the thoughtfulness he was learning to recognize in everyone around him. "I think most people have moments when they wonder who they really are underneath all the roles they play.
The important thing is what you do when you figure it out. As Lucy continued her rounds, Landon realized that his accident had given him more than the ability to hear prayers. It had given him permission to acknowledge the connections he'd been avoiding, to care about the people who had been caring about him all along. For the first time in his adult life, he understood that being a healer wasn't just about fixing bodies. It was about recognizing the humanity in everyone around you, including yourself. And maybe, just maybe, that was a lesson worth learning, even if it had taken a near-death experience to teach it to him.
By his 10th day in the ICU, Landon was no longer content to simply listen to the prayers around him. The weight of what he was hearing, the secrets, the fears, the desperate needs that no one else could address had become unbearable. He began to act with increasing boldness, crossing lines he'd never imagined stepping over. It started with Henry Park, the uninsured college student in bed 2 who was hiding severe chest pain to avoid financial ruin for his family. Landon couldn't stand listening to the boy's prayers grow weaker each night, his pleas for death becoming more frequent as the pain intensified. "Dr. Nicholas," Landon called during morning rounds, "Henry Park needs an immediate cardiac workup. I believe he's having episodes he's not reporting." Eloise looked at Henry's chart, frowning. His self-reported pain levels have been minimal. He's scheduled for discharge this afternoon. Check his troponin levels. Order an EKG. I think you'll find signs of cardiac distress that he's been hiding. Landon, that's a very specific medical request based on what exactly? The test revealed what Landon already knew from Henry's prayers. The young man was experiencing dangerous cardiac episodes, likely triggered by stress and financial anxiety. His condition required immediate intervention that would have been missed if he'd been discharged as planned. "How did you know?" Dr. Nicholas asked later, genuine amazement in her voice. "There were no external signs of cardiac distress." "Sometimes the signs are in what patients don't say as much as what they do," Landon replied, the half-truth burning on his tongue. But Henry's case was just the beginning. That same day, Landon convinced the staff to search Mrs. Vaughn's belongings, where they found the insulin she'd been hiding. Her blood sugar levels had been dangerously erratic, a condition she'd been deliberately causing, while staff attributed it to medication compliance issues. "We need to place Mrs. Vaughn on suicide watch," Landon told Dr. Martinez during his evening visit. "She's been deliberately sabotaging her own medical care." "Based on what evidence?" "She's been hiding her insulin. Check her personal effects." "And Dr. Martinez, she needs psychiatric support. She's carrying guilt about something in her past that's driving her to self-harm." The discovered insulin confirmed Landon's suspicions, but it also raised uncomfortable questions. How had he known to suggest such a specific search? What had made him suspect a patient who showed no outward signs of self-destructive behavior? The questions became more pressing when Landon's intervention with James Morrison proved dramatically accurate. The psychiatric evaluation he'd requested revealed detailed suicide plans and immediate danger, leading to Morrison being placed on involuntary hold just hours before his planned discharge. "This is becoming a pattern," Dr. Nicholas said during a private conversation with Landon late that evening. "Your diagnostic accuracy since the accident has been extraordinary, but it's also unexplainable. You're making medical determinations about patients you've barely interacted with, predicting behaviors that our trained psychiatric staff missed. Maybe my perspective has changed. Being a patient gives you insight into things you miss as a physician." "Landon, you correctly identified 3 separate patients who were hiding serious medical or psychiatric conditions. You suggested specific tests that revealed problems no one suspected. Hospital administration is asking questions about your methods." The words sent a chill through Landon. He'd been so focused on helping the patients whose prayers he could hear that he'd failed to consider how his interventions looked to others.
From the outside, his sudden diagnostic insights appeared either miraculous or suspicious. And in the medical world, miraculous was often treated as suspicious. What kind of questions? The kind that could trigger a formal investigation into your fitness for duty. Some people are wondering if you might be accessing patient information you shouldn't have, or if your head injury has caused some kind of psychological episode that's affecting your judgment. That night, as Landon lay listening to the familiar chorus of prayers around him, he faced a stark reality. His gift, if that's what it was, had allowed him to save lives and provide comfort in ways he'd never imagined possible. But it had also put his career, his reputation, and his future in jeopardy. The voices continued to whisper their fears, hopes, and desperate needs. Timothy Walsh in room 304 was still praying for his mother's peace. Emma George was finding courage to face her pregnancy with family support. Mrs. Mills was fighting harder than ever, sustained by the knowledge that her children valued her life over financial concerns. Each of these victories had been possible because Landon had crossed professional lines, acted on impossible knowledge, risked everything to help people who needed healing that went beyond medicine. But as hospital administrators began asking questions he couldn't answer honestly, Landon realized that his greatest challenge wasn't learning to hear the prayers of others. It was deciding how much he was willing to sacrifice to answer them.
On his 13th night in the ICU, Landon heard a prayer that stopped his heart. God, I don't know if I have the right to ask for anything after all these years, but if my son could forgive me, if Landon could understand that I never stopped loving him, even when I couldn't figure out how to show it. The voice was older, weakened by illness, but unmistakably familiar despite 22 years of silence. In bed 15, admitted under the name Robert Mills, not Robert West, lay the father Landon had sworn never to speak to again. I know I failed him. I know I chose the bottle over my boy too many times. But maybe if he knew how proud I am of what he became. Maybe if he knew that every life he saves makes up for some of the damage I caused. Landon's hands began to shake, not from his injuries, but from the earthquake of emotions that his father's presence had triggered. Robert West, the man who had chosen alcohol over fatherhood, who had missed every important moment of Landon's childhood, who had driven away Landon's mother with his drinking and rage. The same man who was now lying 15 feet away, using a false name and praying for forgiveness that Landon had refused to give for over 22 years. I heard about his accident on the news. Dr. Landon West, they said. My boy. I couldn't stay away, even though I know he doesn't want to see me. I just needed to be close, to know he was going to be okay. Landon closed his eyes, but he couldn't shut out the prayers that revealed truths he'd never imagined. His father hadn't been absent by choice. He'd been hiding his shame, watching Landon's career from a distance, using false names to avoid confronting the son he'd failed. I've been sober for 8 years now, Lord. 8 years too late to matter, but I wanted you to know I tried. I wanted to try to be the man my son deserved to have as a father, even if he'll never know it. 8 years sober. Landon felt something crack inside his chest. For 8 years, his father had been fighting the demon that had destroyed their family, and Landon had never known? For 8 years, he'd assumed his father was still the same broken man who had driven them all away? I'm dying, God. The cancer is spreading, and the doctors say I have maybe a month. I'm not asking for more time. I've wasted enough already.
I'm just asking for the courage to tell my son I'm sorry before I go. Cancer. Dying. 1 month. Landon pressed his call button with trembling fingers. When Lucy Santos appeared, he struggled to keep his voice steady. The patient in bed 15, Robert Mills. What's his condition? Lucy glanced at her tablet, her expression growing somber. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. He was brought in 2 days ago with severe abdominal pain. He's refusing most pain medication, says he wants to stay clear-headed. Family? Emergency contacts? None listed. He said he doesn't have any family left. The lie cut deeper than any physical wound Landon had sustained in his accident. His father was dying alone, believing himself abandoned, while his son lay 20 feet away, finally hearing the truth that 22 years of silence had hidden. Lucy, Landon said carefully, I'd like you to do me a favor. Could you tell Mr. Mills that Dr. West would like to speak with him? Doctor, you're not his attending physician, and he's not really in condition for consultations. Please, just tell him that Dr. Landon West would like to talk to him. See what he says. Lucy looked puzzled, but agreed. Landon watched from his bed as she approached his father, speaking quietly. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Robert's face went white, his hands began to shake, and tears started streaming down his cheeks. He wants to see me? Robert whispered, loud enough for Landon to hear across the bay. He specifically asked to speak with you, Lucy confirmed. Robert looked across the ICU bay towards Landon's bed, their eyes meeting for the first time in over 22 years. The man Landon Fall wasn't the angry, intoxicated father of his memories. This was someone broken by illness and regret. Someone who had been carrying the weight of his failures alone for years. Son? Robert's voice was barely audible, filled with hope and terror. Hello, Dad. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with 22 years of hurt, anger, and buried love. Robert tried to sit up in his bed, wincing at the pain, but desperate to close the distance between them. You look good, son. Even with all those bandages, you look good. You look sick, Landon replied, his clinical assessment automatic, but his voice gentle. I am sick. I'm dying, Landon. I probably shouldn't have come here, but when I heard about your accident, I couldn't stay away. I had to know you were going to be okay. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Landon could have imagined. His father's prayers had revealed the skeleton of truth, but hearing it spoken aloud filled in the devastating details. 8 years of sobriety, maintained in isolation because Robert believed he'd lost the right to contact his son. A modest apartment where he'd kept newspaper clippings of every article written about Dr. Landon West's medical accomplishments. A wallet containing a 22-year-old photo of Landon at his medical school graduation. A ceremony Robert had watched from the back of the auditorium without revealing himself. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, Robert's words punctuated by the effort of speaking through pain. I know I failed you in every way a father can fail a son. But I need you to know that I'm proud of you. I'm proud of the man you became despite having me for a father. Landon felt tears streaming down his face. Tears for the years they'd lost, for the pain they'd both carried, for the love that had survived despite everything that should have killed it. Dad, I've spent 22 years being angry at you. But lying here, seeing things differently, maybe it's time to stop being angry and start being family again. Robert's face collapsed with relief and gratitude. I don't have long, son. A month, maybe less. But if I could spend some of that time getting to know who you are now, learning about the incredible doctor you became. We have time, Landon said softly. However much time you have left, we have it. As the night deepened around them, father and son talked across the ICU bay, filling in the gaps of 2 decades with shared memories, apologies, and the tentative rebuilding of a relationship that had been broken but never completely destroyed. And for the first time since his accident, Landon understood that his gift of hearing prayers wasn't just about helping other people heal. Sometimes it was about learning to forgive the people who had hurt you most and discovering that love could survive even the deepest wounds if you were brave enough to let it try.
By his 15th day in the ICU, Landon was drowning in voices. The prayers had multiplied beyond anything he could have imagined when this began. It wasn't just the patients in his immediate bay anymore. He could hear whispered pleas from throughout the hospital. Surgical patients on the 3rd floor begging for successful operations. Children in pediatrics praying for their parents to stop crying. Families in the waiting rooms pleading for miracles they weren't sure they believed in. The chorus of human need was constant now, overlapping and interweaving until Landon couldn't distinguish between his own thoughts and the desperate whispers of others. Sleep had become impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, another voice would break through, carrying another burden he felt compelled to address. Please, don't let the surgery tomorrow find more cancer. Please let this be the end of it. God, help me tell my children about the divorce. Help them understand it's not their fault. I can't afford this treatment. Please show me another way, or give me the strength to let my family know how much debt we're in. Each prayer was a human soul in crisis, and Landon found himself trying to carry them all. He'd convinced Dr. Nicholas to order additional tests for the patient worried about cancer recurrence, tests that found exactly what the patient feared. He'd arranged for a social worker to speak with the divorcing parent about how to talk to children. He'd connected the financially struggling patient with hospital financial counselors. Every intervention saved someone from suffering, but each success made the gift stronger, expanding his range until he could hear prayers from blocks away. Landon, you look terrible, Dr. Nicholas said during her morning visit. When was the last time you slept? I sleep, he lied, though they both knew it wasn't true. The bags under his eyes had deepened into shadows. His hands shook from exhaustion, and his vital signs showed the strain of carrying psychological weight that no human body was designed to bear. Your heart rate is elevated, your blood pressure is climbing, and you're showing signs of severe sleep deprivation. I'm concerned that you're pushing yourself too hard with these insights about other patients. I can't stop listening. The words slipped out before he could catch them, revealing more than he'd intended. Dr. Nicholas's expression shifted from medical concern to something deeper. What do you mean you can't stop listening? Landon closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 2 weeks of impossible secrets pressing down on him. Around him, the prayers continued. A mother in the maternity ward begging for her premature baby to survive the night. An elderly man in cardiac care apologizing to his deceased wife for not telling her he loved her enough.
I mean that since the accident, I hear things I shouldn't be able to hear, and I can't make it stop. Dr. Nicholas pulled a chair closer to his bed, her voice dropping to the gentle tone she used with patients experiencing psychiatric breaks. Landon, auditory hallucinations are a known complication of head trauma. They can seem very real, very compelling, but they're not hallucinations, Eloise. Landon opened his eyes, meeting her gaze with desperate honesty. Every diagnosis I've made, every intervention I've suggested, I haven't been guessing. I've been hearing what people pray for when they think no one is listening. The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Nicholas stared at him with an expression that cycled through disbelief, concern, and professional alarm. Landon, you need psychiatric care. What you're describing isn't medically possible. Mrs. Patterson prayed last night that the chemotherapy wouldn't make her too sick to attend her granddaughter's recital next week. Mr. Nicholas asked God to help him live long enough to walk his daughter down the aisle in December. Your patient in room 12 is planning to refuse dialysis because he thinks his insurance won't cover long-term treatment. Each specific detail made Dr. Nicholas's expression grow more troubled. These were private patient concerns, some of which she hadn't even been aware of herself. How could you possibly know any of that? Because I can hear their prayers, Eloise. I can hear everyone's prayers, and it's killing me. The admission hung between them like a confession of madness. Dr. Nicholas was looking at him the way medical professionals look at patients who've lost touch with reality, with compassion, but also with the clinical detachment necessary to make difficult decisions about someone's mental health. I'm going to have Dr. Reeves come back, and I think we need to discuss adjusting your medication. What you're experiencing is real. Eloise, check on the patient in room 12. Ask him about dialysis. Ask Mrs. Patterson about her granddaughter's recital. If I'm having delusions, the details won't match reality. Dr. Nicholas hesitated, clearly torn between professional skepticism and years of trusting Landon's medical judgment. And if the details do match, then maybe you need to consider that there are things about healing that medical school doesn't teach. As Dr. Nicholas left to verify what seemed impossible, Landon lay back in his bed and listened to the endless chorus of human need that surrounded him. The gift that had started as whispers from nearby patients had become a flood of voices from throughout the hospital and beyond. He was beginning to understand that every miracle came with a price. The question was whether he was strong enough to pay it, and whether the people he could help were worth the cost of his own sanity. Around him, the prayers continued, each one a life that could be touched, a soul that could be comforted, a crisis that could be resolved if he was willing to sacrifice himself to answer them all.
The prayer that ended everything was his own. On his 17th day in the ICU, as dawn broke over a hospital filled with suffering he could no longer bear to hear, Landon West finally spoke to God, not as a skeptical surgeon analyzing an impossible phenomenon, but as a broken man who had learned to listen with his heart. "I don't know if you're real," he whispered into the quiet morning air. "I've spent my whole life believing in things I could prove, measure, control. But if you are real, if this gift came from you, I need to understand why. Why me? Why now? And what do you want me to do with what I've learned?" For the first time since his accident, the hospital around him fell silent. The constant chorus of prayers that had nearly driven him to madness suddenly stopped, leaving him alone with his thoughts in a way he hadn't experienced in weeks. In that silence, understanding came not as another voice in his head, but as a deep knowing that settled into his bones like warmth. The accident hadn't been random. The gift hadn't been a medical anomaly or a psychological break. He had been chosen, not to hear every prayer, not to solve every problem, but to learn what healing really meant, to understand that medicine without compassion was just sophisticated mechanics, that saving bodies without touching souls was incomplete healing. "I understand now," he said softly. "You didn't give me this ability to make me a miracle worker. You gave it to me to make me human again, to show me that the people I've been treating for 15 years weren't just medical cases. They were whole human beings with fears and hopes and needs that went far beyond what I could fix with a scalpel." As if in response to his realization, the voices began to return, but different now, quieter, more manageable, filtered through the wisdom he'd gained rather than overwhelming him with their intensity. He could still hear Timothy Walsh in room 304, but the 8-year-old's prayers had changed. Instead of asking God to comfort his mother, Timothy was now praying with the confidence of a child who knew his family was going to be okay, whatever happened to him. Emma George was no longer afraid of her pregnancy. She was asking for wisdom to be a good mother and strength to finish her education. Mrs. Mills was praying with gratitude for each day she had with her children, her prayers now filled with joy rather than despair. And his father. Robert's prayers had transformed from desperate pleas for forgiveness into quiet conversations with God about making the most of whatever time he had left with his son. "Dr. West," Lucy Santos appeared beside his bed, her expression showing the concern that had been growing for days. "Dr. Nicholas asked me to check on you. She said you had an unusual night." "I had a conversation," Landon replied, his voice calmer than it had been in weeks. "A very important conversation." "With Dr. Nicholas? She mentioned that you were experiencing some auditory symptoms." "With myself, actually, and maybe with someone else." "Lucy, do you believe in things that can't be medically explained?" She studied his face, seeing something different there. "I believe that healing involves more than medicine, if that's what you're asking. I've seen too many recoveries that didn't make clinical sense. Too many patients who survived because they had something to fight for beyond their diagnosis." "What if I told you that my accident taught me to hear what people really need? Not just their medical needs, but their human needs." She was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer with the thoughtfulness he'd learned to appreciate in her. "I'd say that sounds like the kind of doctor I'd want taking care of me or my family." Over the following days, something remarkable happened. Landon's interventions with patients became more subtle, more natural. Instead of predicting specific medical complications, he simply spent time listening, really listening to what people said and what they didn't say. He learned to read the spaces between words, to recognize when someone needed emotional support as much as medical treatment. Dr. Nicholas noticed the change immediately. "You seem different, more settled. Are the auditory symptoms improving?" "I'm learning to live with them," Landon replied honestly. "More importantly, I'm learning what they're trying to teach me, which is that being a great surgeon isn't enough. I need to learn how to be a great healer." On his 19th day in the ICU, Dr. Nicholas announced that he was ready for discharge. His injuries had healed sufficiently for outpatient recovery, and his mental status, while different from before his accident, no longer showed signs of acute distress. "When will you be ready to return to surgery?" she asked as they discussed his rehabilitation timeline.
Landon looked around the ICU that had been his world for nearly 3 weeks. He could still hear prayers, but they no longer overwhelmed him. Instead, they reminded him of the responsibility that came with the privilege of healing others. "I should be soon," he said, "but when I come back, I'll be a different kind of surgeon." Different how? The kind who remembers that every patient is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's whole world. The kind who treats the person, not just the problem. As Landon was wheeled out of the ICU for the last time as a patient, he heard one final prayer. This one from Timothy Walsh, still fighting his battle in room 304. "Thank you, God, for sending Dr. West to help everyone understand that healing is about more than medicine. Help him remember what he learned here when he goes back to saving people, and help him know that sometimes the most important thing a doctor can do is listen." The prayer followed him into the hallway, into the elevator, and out into the world where he would soon return to surgery with hands that were just as skilled as before, but guided by a heart that had finally learned to listen. The gift of hearing prayers was temporary, but the gift of understanding what healing really meant would last forever.
Six months later, Dr. Landon West returned to the operating room of St. Mary's Hospital. To outside observers, he appeared to be the same skilled surgeon he'd always been, precise, focused, utterly competent in the face of life and death decisions. But the people who worked closest with him noticed differences. Dr. West, surgical nurse Jennifer Martinez, looked up from her instrument tray during a complex cardiac procedure. "The patient's blood pressure is starting to climb. Should we increase the anesthesia?" Landon paused in his work, his hands still as he considered not just the medical indicators, but the whole person lying on his table. "Let's talk to him first," he said quietly. "Mr. Johnson, I know you can hear me, even though you're under anesthesia. Your heart is working a little too hard right now, and I think it's because you're worried about your family. I want you to know that your wife and daughter are in the waiting room, and they're not worried about anything except having you come home healthy. You can relax now. We've got this." The patient's blood pressure immediately began to normalize. The surgical team exchanged glances, but no one questioned the approach that had become Dr. West's trademark since his return. "How did you know that would work?" Dr. Nicholas asked later as they reviewed the successful surgery. "Because I learned that healing happens on more levels than we usually acknowledge," Landon replied. Mr. Johnson wasn't just worried about the surgery, he was worried about leaving his family in debt if something went wrong. Addressing that fear was as important as the medical procedure. Dr. Nicholas smiled. "The accident changed you, didn't it? It taught me to listen. Really listen." The changes went beyond the operating room. Landon had become spending time in the ICU during his off hours, not as a physician, but as someone who understood what patients were going through. He'd sit with families during long nights, helping them navigate not just medical decisions, but the emotional journey of having a loved one in crisis. Emma George, now 8 months pregnant and finishing her senior year of high school, had sent him a thank you card. "Dr. West, you helped me find the courage to tell my family about the baby. They're so excited to be grandparents and uncle. Thank you for reminding me that love is stronger than fear." Mrs. Dorothy Mills had made a full recovery and sent regular updates about her grandchildren, always ending with, "Thank you for helping me remember I was worth fighting for." And Timothy Walsh. Timothy had passed away peacefully 2 months after Landon's discharge, but not before his family had found a peace and acceptance that allowed them to celebrate his life rather than just mourn his death. His mother had written, "Timothy always said that Dr. West taught everyone in the hospital to listen with their hearts. That's how we knew it was okay to let him go when he was ready." But perhaps the most profound change was in Landon's relationship with his father. Robert West had spent his final weeks in a hospice facility, with Landon visiting every day. They'd used that time to rebuild 22 years of lost connection,
sharing stories, apologies, and the kind of love that can survive even the deepest wounds. "I'm proud of the man you became," Robert had whispered on his last day. "More importantly, I'm proud of the man you're becoming." Now, as Landon walked through the corridors at the end of another long day, he could still hear whispers. Not the overwhelming chorus of desperate prayers from his time as a patient, but the subtle cues that every human being sends when they're in need of compassion. He heard them in the way a nurse rubbed her temples after a difficult shift, in the slight tremor in a family member's voice when asking about visiting hours, in the careful way an elderly patient asked if the treatment was really necessary or if it was time to consider other options. He couldn't hear their prayers anymore, but he had learned to hear their humanity. And that, he realized, was the real gift. "Dr. West?" Lucy Santos approached him in the hallway, her expression warm with the friendship that had developed since his recovery. "There's a young man in the ICU, bed 7, who's having a hard time. Car accident, similar to yours. He's asking for you specifically." Landon nodded, understanding. "What's his name?" "Henry Park, medical student actually. Heard about your reputation for connecting with patients who are struggling." As they walked toward the ICU, Landon reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. An accident that should have ended his career had instead taught him what his career was really meant to be about. A gift that had nearly driven him to madness had ultimately shown him the path to true healing. He entered the ICU as he had thousands of times before, but now he came not just as a surgeon who could fix bodies, but as someone who understood that healing meant listening to the whole person, their fears, their hopes, their whispered conversations with whatever force they believed might be listening. And in that listening, he had found not just his calling, but his humanity. The boy in bed 7 looked up as Landon approached, hope flickering in his eyes despite his pain and fear. "He heard you understand what it's like," Henry said quietly. "I do, and I'm here to listen." As the sun set over the hospital, Dr. Landon West began another conversation with another soul in need of healing, carrying forward the lesson his accident had taught him, that the most powerful medicine isn't what we can inject or prescribe, but the simple act of truly hearing another human being's deepest needs. And sometimes that's miracle enough.